he's willing to do what we petition. This is the reason why, because if we never ask, why would he move on our behalf? You sitting there with your mouth closed. Why would God move on your behalf or our behalf if we don't petition him for what we need of him? He says in his word, hear my prayer. The word prayer is a noun, and at its etymological root, it means to intervene. And I don't know about you, but there are some things that I need the Lord to intervene in. There was this TV show on A&E some years ago called Intervention, where people were messed up on drugs and alcohol and all of those things, and the show was circled around family members that cared so much about the person that was afflicted with this addiction that they intervened even though they did not ask for help. And that is a problem with so many people, that God is not like man. God is not going to intervene in our situation until we ask God to intervene in our situation. God intervene in my marriage. God intervene in my ministry. God intervene in my finances. God intervene in whatever area you need him. Because I want to tell you, if you are big enough and strong enough to fix it up and make it all better, you would have been done it by now. You would be in that case for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, a lifetime, if you were strong enough to fix it yourself. But if you need and you're tired of going back and forth, running in a ditch, I want to suggest to you that you need to pray to God that he intervenes in your situation. And I want to tell you, if you pray to God, he will come see about you. We see here that this psalmist wants God to hear him. He wants God to move on his behalf. He wants God to intervene in a situation that he has created for himself. Who is it that he wants to intervene? When we look at this text, the text is clear, unless my comprehension is off. If my exegetical research is inaccurate, we have to see that the verbiage in verse 1, the A clause, tells us unanimously that he wants the Lord to deal with this situation. Not the pastor, not the friend, not the wife, not the choir, not the trustees, not the deacon, not the job, not the fraternity, not the sorority, but he wants the Lord to deal with this. And we see here, church, that this man shows us something that we ought to model. For when we find ourselves in calamity and in a crisis, this text shows us two things that we ought to apply to our life. Here are two spiritual nuggets that we ought to walk away with. The first thing that we ought to see out of verse 1, the A clause, is simply this, that the psalmist shows us what we ought to do in such situations. That when we find ourselves in a calamitous situation, that the first thing that we need to do is pray. The second thing that the psalm shows us of what we ought to call on and whom we ought to call on, that we ought to call on the Lord. He shows us what we ought to do, which is to pray. And he tells us whom we ought to pray to is the Lord. And again, as we begin to observe what this psalmist is saying to us, we have to see that he understands that there is no one on earth and in earth that can get him out of his situation. And that is why his request is singular. His prayer request is singular. His There's only one person that he's making petition for. There's only one person that he's calling on to do something for him. And listen to the words of his voice in clause 2, in the B clause of this text, where it says, and let my cry for help come to you. Yeah. Again, we see that his prayer request is pointed. It is intentional. That he's calling on help from the Lord. Listen what he says in the text. And let my cry for help come to you. Let my cry for help come to you. Not to the pastor, not to the deacons, not to the CEO, not to Barack, Katie, Oprah, or Michelle, but let my cry come to you. And when you are in a situation that is tight, when you are in a situation that is dark and dire, I want to suggest to you that before you cry out to anybody else, we need to cry unto the rock of our salvation. The psalmist, he is clear that regardless of the situation that his low living has brought him to, that his wild and wayward ways have brought him to, that there is no one else that can get him out of his situation but the Lord. I like this, church, because when we begin to transition out of the truth of verse 1, and we begin to look and consider what it said in verse 2, it shows us how deep he has fallen in his current situation. The Word of God says this in verse 2 in Psalm 102 in the A clause. Do not hide your face from me in the day of my distress. I'm going to read it one more time. Do not hide your face from me in the day of my distress. So many times when we are going through situations that are tight, because distress means straits. It means to be in a tight situation. Have you ever seen those movies in those psychiatric wards where the mentally maladjusted find themselves in straitjackets? Well, many times in life, situations that we find ourselves in can put us in a spiritual straitjacket. That we struggle with it, we try to get out, we try to break free, but we cannot get out. And there is no one that can help us, that there's no friends. The people that you used to run with, the people you used to get in them streets with, they are nowhere to be found. But the psalmist has figured out that when I find myself in a tight situation, when I find myself in a dark situation, when I find myself in a situation that is detrimental to my spiritual health and my spiritual well-being, that I don't need to call on nobody else but the Lord, because the only person that can get me out of my dark and tight situation is